What's up, barbell athletes? I recently had a conversation with the legend Marcus Philly on his Look Good, Move Well podcast, which I'll share with you in a minute. But some of the key points that we talked about are what mobility training really is and how you can use it to reduce your pain and improve your performance, how to reduce any pain you may be feeling while under the barbell, and how to improve your squat depth and your overhead position in just 5 minutes per day. Whether your goal is actually to reduce pain or just to move better in general, I find that it's really easy to get caught in the weeds when it comes to mobility training and to feel like the process to improve your mobility is complicated. And what do we do when things feel complicated? Nothing. We pass off the idea as something that takes too much effort and rely on things that seem to be more simple and easy to manage, which is why I think it is so crucial that we simplify getting results when it comes to mobility training, so that it's so much easier to take the power back into your hands and reap the benefits that improved mobility can offer you. So if you're ready, grab a pen and paper because there's some epic nuggets that I drop in here that make things very simple and approachable. You're going to want to take note of them. Let's dive in.
All right, welcome, Matt. We usually do a little banter to get things going. So this is your first trip to the Bay Area?
First trip to California in general.
Awesome. And you're coming from?
Ottawa, Canada.
Look at that.
It's a bit of a trip.
Yeah, okay. So what lesson did you learn about San Francisco 2 days ago when you were out on the ferry?
The weather changes extremely rapidly, really fast.
Yeah,
it was crazy windy.
Give us the story. What was happening?
Well, we were on the ferry to Alcatraz, and it was like sunny outside, and then so we get on the ferry, go up to the top deck, I guess.
Yeah.
And within 10 minutes, it's like our lips are rattling in the wind and our hair's flowing all over the place and getting splashed and stuff. So the weather was pretty wild there, but the trip to Alcatraz was gorgeous either way. And I think that kind of provided a little bit of like an eerie vibe too, because it was the evening.
Yes.
So yeah, I don't know if you've ever been to Alcatraz.
I have several times. Yeah.
It's
well, not every local
cool.
has been. It's a very good trip to make. But your experience reminded me of the famous quote, which now I'm forgetting who actually said it, but it might have been like Sinatra or somebody like that. But it was like the coldest winter I ever experienced was my summer in San Francisco.
That's hilarious. I'm from Canada, right? So winters are pretty wild up there.
Obviously, I think the reference is like you come thinking California,
right?
I'm coming down to, close to the ocean. I'll bring my shorts, I'll bring my tank tops, and you go out like the middle of August and it's supposed to be hot and it's just freezing in the 40s with wind and fog. And this is where they get everybody buying the I Love San Francisco sweatshirts down on the
right.
At the wharf.
Exactly.
Yeah.
My wife went off and she's like, I need to buy a sweater. This is insane.
Now she has an Alcatraz sweater, right?
Exactly. I have been surprisingly cold, honestly. I was very surprised by that.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like not matching expectations.
And the fog, I could not believe how foggy it was.
Yeah, it gets thick. I mean, the fog is so thick. You're like, is it raining or is it just foggy?
It looked like smoke. It was that thick.
We
couldn't. So when we were flying in, we couldn't even see the Golden Gate Bridge.
Yeah, exactly.
And driving on the Golden Gate Bridge, we could not see the Golden Gate Bridge.
Yep, okay. So fair warning to all of you people coming out to California to visit us here in San Francisco. If it's in the summertime, pack your sweatshirts. If it's in the wintertime, pack your raincoats. You do get some nice weather, and especially if you come up to the gym, which is north of the city, it's usually a little bit warmer. So thank you for sharing. Now, we've got that out of the way. Please tell the audience, who you are and what do you do? What is your fitness career built around?
Yeah, so my name is Matt. I am the owner of Primal Mobility, and we've been in the mobility coaching space for about 8 years now. We predominantly work with barbell-based athletes.
Okay.
Barbell enthusiasts. So anyone who's curious about improving how they feel under a barbell, we're there to support that curiosity. So predominantly we're looking at CrossFit athletes and Olympic weightlifting athletes. We dabble into powerlifting as well, but we're really focused on, the three main positions under a barbell. So the deep squat, the front rack, and the overhead position. Mm-hmm. We've worked with over 6,000 clients at this point, anyone from the CrossFit Games all the way down to weekend warriors. So we are a strength-based mobility coaching company, and we really focus on making sure that our clients feel better in the deepest ranges of motion, and not just kind of being able to access them, but being able to confidently control them while under a barbell.
Sweet.
So that's
I mean, I'm still learning a lot about you and about your business as we've gotten to know each other over the last couple of days, and we're going to spend more time tomorrow together. And mobility is a very, very important topic for us at Functional Bodybuilding. And it's one thing we get asked about all the time. And as somebody who doesn't spend all of their time thinking about mobility, whereas you
That is
you
me.
do,
I do that,
you
yep.
probably wake up thinking about all of it. When somebody asks you, who's kind of maybe a lay person or just doesn't have a lot of background, like, hey, what is mobility? How do you define that?
Yeah. So the easiest way to kind of describe it is control and strength within those deeper ranges of motion. So we actually have a lot of conversations with people who say, I have great mobility, and they're referring to being able to catch a barbell almost behind their head in a snatch, but they can't stabilize the bar there. So they're able to get there, but they have no stability, no functional control or strength within those positions. And that's kind of like where we dive into that and be like, so you have good flexibility, you have good access to those deep ranges of motion, but you don't necessarily have the capacity within that, right? So I kind of come in and say, we need to develop that strength and control within those ranges of motion to make sure that you're not just accessing them from external loading. You're not just able to get there through being pushed, right, with a barbell or whatever the case is, but you're able to bring yourself there and then take on stress within those positions as well.
For somebody who's not maybe listening, who is not a barbell athlete, or let's say you're talking to somebody who's not a barbell athlete, they're more everyday life. What are some examples or analogies that you use to like emphasize that same point?
Yeah. So like an analogy that I use often is like, if you're out, let's say, I don't know how relevant this is going to be to people outside of Canada, but if you're out in the winter and it's like icy outside and you slip on the ice and one leg goes one way, one leg goes the other way, naturally you're going to fall into a deep split position. And if you don't have good control or access to those ranges of motion, you're going to basically, your nervous system's going to freak out and you're going to potentially injure yourself, right? Whereas if you have good flexibility, good mobility, you're going to be able to get into those positions more comfortably and not be fearful of injury. Now, if you had great mobility, you'd be able to kind of pull yourself out of that position without even using your arms. You just kind of like do like a reverse split almost, right? So that's right. Kind of like the sign of strength. How well are you able to control those deep ranges of motion that you may be pushed or forced into from things that you're not, like external forces?
Sure. Now I'm trying to think about like my parents or like an aging population. And I don't want to put a decade on it because someone's gonna be like, don't call me old. I'm not aging. I'm not, like if I say 50s, like if somebody in their 50s who's aging, they'd be like, I'm not aging. But okay, let's just generally say somebody who's getting older and starting to become fearful of hurting themselves in day-to-day life, picking over and bending picking something up, bending over. I think about my mom. She had a rotator cuff injury like a couple of years ago. And yeah, there was probably a lot of things underlying that before it happened. But like the event was like reaching back in the back seat to help out the kids.
Oh yeah. Okay.
And then something that was the triggering event that sort of sent her into this pain spiral. So, do you have like, I imagine you encounter people that are in that group. And do you talk about it any different way, or is there, specific examples that tend to like really resonate with that group for you? I know I just named a couple, but are there others that you have?
Like specific injuries, you mean? Or
yeah, or like specific cases. Like you hear people say like, "Hey, I'm just really nervous about this thing because I'm, I'm older, so I'm nervous about that."
Yeah, well, we talk to a lot of people who are either just kind of getting introduced to the gym or there are even people who have been in the gym for a long period of time, but maybe have gone through years of bad habits with their movements and stuff like that. I think that as they approach getting into loaded positions that are generally compromised in some way, so sometimes spinal flexion, anything of like rounding your back, right? These, or knees over toes, these are all things that have been demonized over the years in the industry and can cause some fear for some people and some injuries within those spaces, within those positions, sorry. Those are generally things that we see a lot of. And then, of course, those that are not so often in the gym space, you actually hear a lot of things about like reaching into the back seat.
Yeah.
That's one of the more common ways that people seem to injure themselves, generally a back injury. But yeah, like that's also a common one, or bending down to pick something up, or like grandparents picking up their grandchildren and stuff like that too.
Yeah. And then also like the incidental falls that happen at progressive ages too. That's, are people falling and then having an impact that creates the injury, or are they just falling into ranges of motion that they're not strong in, or it's usually a combination of both? But
correct. Yeah, exactly. It's a bit of both, I would say. I mean, as you get older, impact injuries, like your bones are more brittle. Like you're gonna injure yourself from that impact a little bit more easily. But I think as we're getting older, I think it's kind of a combination of the two for sure.
Yeah, it was really okay. So this is a good lead in, I think, to the next kind of point that you mentioned. You said to me yesterday, or we exchanged kind of thoughts on this in our training session. But yeah, I'll get people that come in to starting training, and they're starting a functional bodybuilding program, or we've had a lot of friends, family members that have sort of kind of come to join our community workouts, and they're nervous for a number of reasons.
Right.
Am I going to be out of shape? Is this going to be so hard? Am I going to throw up? But I think there's also that underlying fear of like, I don't know if I've not lifted weights in a long time, or ever maybe. And I've seen in these positions I'm afraid of these positions, or I've heard some of these things might be bad for you. Talk about this concept of like, are there bad positions that people are getting into in the gym? Are there ones that are like, you should never do that thing? And do you subscribe to that as a coach, as a company, or do you have a different perspective?
So that's actually one of the fundamental principles of like how we coach and what we subscribe to mentally as we're approaching somebody who is dealing with discomfort in certain positions, or who is fearful in general of movement in some way. One of our principles is spend more time in the positions you wish to improve, as well as, well, we'll dive into that, I suppose. That could be separate for sure, but it kind of ties into it. As well as there are no dangerous positions, just lack of preparedness. So I'm a big believer in the fact that those positions that seem scary or that have been demonized over the years, again, like spinal flexion, rounding your back in a deadlift or something like that, the injury rates within that have generally been because people have spent so much time hammering in a neutral spine and really just getting very good in that position, very strong in that position, that anytime they move away from that and are exposed to stress outside of that, they are more vulnerable and more susceptible to injury. So our approach is to expose those in a very controlled manner, as well as just kind of progressively, right? Just make sure that it's progressive and make sure that it meets them where they're at. Like never would I ask you to just throw on 225 on a barbell and just start there, right? Yeah. And you're in anything, honestly. Yeah. So never would we do that in these generally compromised positions. So we look to find these positions that are creating fear and expose you to them. It's almost like, we expose you to them so that you can learn that they aren't dangerous. It's just that you have been weak there. So the more you get into them, the more your nervous system will start to catch on that there's no danger here. The fear doesn't need to be present. Yep. And then that's when people start to get a little bit more comfortable with starting to load up and starting to engage more of their muscles in those positions more effectively. And then ultimately they become more resilient and less fearful and less painful within those positions too.
Yeah. It's like when somebody comes in and they're afraid of exercise, I think I've had a big shift as a coach over the years where I probably used to be like, no, you don't need to be you don't need to be scared of it, right? Like trying to like encourage them or accelerate that thought process. And I can think about it like now as a parent and the way that we're parenting, it's like when a kid cries, the last thing I want to do is tell them like, you're not sad, like stop crying, like you don't need to be like, they're having a real feeling and it's
right.
And it's valid.
Yeah,
for
it's
them.
like when someone has depression and you're like, "Hey, have you tried not worrying so much? Or
Yeah,
have you tried
like you're
not
you're
worrying
not
about
sad.
it?
Like don't be sad.
Have you
it's
tried
like,
being happier?
Come in and you're afraid to exercise. There's a good reason for that.
Right.
If somebody hasn't done the thing, it's healthy to be afraid of it because you don't know what you don't know. Like you don't know that could be bad. And so I feel like it's, we want to encourage, not encourage fear, but like certainly not.
Aim to understand it at least.
Understand it as coaches, right?
Yeah, I agree. And I think that that's also been something that I've learned along the way too, is like, okay, let's start getting you in there wherever, like, where's the entry point? I think that's the tricky part of what we do, is that a lot of times that there is fear and pain. There's hesitation, right?
Sure.
So we have to find a logical entry point that's not only logical, but accepted by the individual as well.
Yeah.
And then start building up from there progressively.
So we're going to expose people more to the thing that they're afraid of. We got to do it in a way that we got to get them over the initial fear to even try. The way you do that is through a process of regression and getting, things down to a level that like, oh, I can do that. Like jump on the box, the 24-inch box. No way. But
Right.
how about the 1-inch thing right here?
The plate
Right. Or step up onto the 12-inch box. How about we start there? Right. So this is actually making me go back to what you were saying at the beginning, because you were describing what you do as a mobility coach. And I almost like kind of, cheekily shot in like, oh, so basically you're just a strength coach is what you are.
Cause pretty much. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, cause you're thinking
Actually,
about this.
Exactly it.
You're a strength coach who's maybe focused on end range.
Exactly.
Can you actually describe that again for just the audience? Cause like, I don't know that everyone always understands what does that even mean? What is end range, or what is mid range, or short, long range? What is that?
Right.
What are all those terms?
Yeah, it's all just terms of describing various different points within range of motion, right? So end range can generally mean, like when we speak about end range, it's often understood to be like the deepest stretch position that your muscle can handle, like the furthest you can access within the muscle. But what a lot of people also don't think of when it comes to mobility is that your muscle itself needs to be strong throughout the entire range of motion that it has access to. So end range can also mean the shortest range of motion as well. So if you're looking at a bicep curl, for example, all the way at the bottom, you're going to have the bicep at the most lengthened state. And then all the way at the top of the curl, the bicep's going to be at the most shortened state. So the way we approach these things is to develop strength within both of those capacities in the end range, because that's traditionally where people are their weakest, and where a lot of people will start to compensate for movements because they don't have the good control or the good strength within those positions. So that's when you'll see people at the bottom of a squat trying to stand up out of it and, doing what we call like a stripper squat, where the hips will shoot up first, and then they'll do like a bit of a good morning where they kind of lower back the entire barbell up because they weren't able to maybe hold on to the end range of ankle dorsiflexion. Right. So, I mean, I don't want to bring in too much biomechanics jargon so that it's not confusing, but.
This is a perfect opportunity to say we can talk about this with biomechanics and, kind of textbook language, or we could be really simple about it and really just remind people that mobility can be simple.
Right. So holding on to deep ankle dorsiflexion within the bottom of the squat means just letting your knee stay over your toes for as long as you can, kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
Like simplifying the language like that. But I think that that's an important distinction, or at least kind of a perspective for people to hold on to, is that we're not only just stretching or lengthening in the mobility process. We're really focused on control as a whole and developing that relationship with the deeper end ranges. So we also need to consider the short range, right? So not just stretching out the hip flexors, but also getting stronger with the hip and deep flexion as well. And I think that like people being introduced to that idea could be a bit eye-opening and like, oh, that could help my hip feel a lot better if I'm approaching it in multiple different ways and not just stretching the area that feels tight.
Yeah. So for those people that are like listening right now, and not getting to see your like, gestures, if somebody is, let's just focus on the hips, like the hip flexors, right? So what's a classic way people mobilize hip extension that you see people doing?
So like a classic hip flexor stretch being your knees on the ground and you're just driving your hip forward as far as you can, basically.
Like a lunge or like,
like a deep lunge position.
Like a deep lunge, or people know the couch stretch.
Couch stretch, yeah, couch exactly.
Stretch. And so then you're talking, that's potentially mobilizing end range, and then the short range, that's long range, but like the short range of the hip flexor, what does developing control and strength there look like? What could somebody be thinking about doing?
So the way we approach things is, as I said, like we want to approach it progressively. So over time, you're going to try and find ways to implement progressive overload principles to that. But to just talk about the movement itself, like if you're just sitting there and pulling your knee up to your chest.
Yeah. So sitting on your desk, at your desk right now, just lifting your thigh as high as you can,
holding it there, or even just going through reps. Like, just doing those things more often is going to help you build more strength and control within that. Yeah. Right. So again,
that's again how you're like, okay, because I want that point to be driven home that like mobility, we're defining mobility in this, chat right now, this 30-minute chat. It's not just, the classic, like, oh, I got to stretch the thing as far as I go. It's not just stretching. It's, yes, there's a stretch, or there's taking things to the, the more commonly thought of end range of like long, tissue length, but then also shortening them and working on like the control of lifting your thigh up from a chair, and that strength that happens at that end of the range of motion.
Exactly. So, I mean, end range, whether it's passive, it's achieved passively or actively, you're still within your end range, right? And there's multiple ways, like you can be training it passively and actively, and generally people respond best to kind of a combination of the two, because again, like we'll dive into this in another episode, I guess, but really it's a game of influencing the nervous system is what it comes down to. So whether you're getting there passively or actively, so stretching your hip flexors in like a couch stretch, that would be a passive stretch, whereas actively pulling your knee up to your chest, that is an active short range hip flexion exercise. Whether you're doing it passively or actively, like you're getting into those end range positions. Yeah. And it's important to make sure that you're aware that you should be doing both. Yeah. But the way that most people see it is that foam rolling and stretching in general, those two things that's the extent of mobility work.
And do you even categorize that as mobility work, or is
that's like an ingredient within the recipe? Yeah. So
if it serves the purpose of helping develop strength in end ranges, then it serves
exactly. You sprinkle it in. Like usually in our programs, we have passive work. We are a strength-based company, so we focus a lot on active work to make sure that people feel like they have good control of those deep ranges. Yeah. But we have passive work, and we generally start our workouts there. It's like, let's start getting your nervous system ready to understand that we want to use those ranges of motion. Yeah. Open them up a little bit, and then let's start working within them, like putting in serious work, more intensity.
Cool. All right. Well, in the spirit of keeping this conversation all about simplicity, let's just talk about this idea of just, hey, spend more time in the position. Give us the, give somebody who's like, comes to you and like, hey, I've got these 20 different drills that I do, and I do all this activation, I do all this stuff, I'm trying to improve my squat. And then you ask the question, how often do you bend in the bottom of your squat? And they're like, I don't know, I do 30 reps of squats twice a week.
That 1 second at the bottom of each rep. Yeah. So again, that's like what I was saying earlier. That's one of our principles. And the reason I say that's one of our principles, we have like 10 main principles that, because we also have a certification course that we educate coaches through. And we have 10 main principles to really kind of track and keep as a perspective to make sure that you're easily simplifying the process. Because if you let it, it can be overly complicated and become complex relatively quickly. But I think that if you're just, and I was saying earlier that it's really a game of influencing the nervous system. Your nervous system adapts to the stimulus that it's placed under.
Yeah.
So if you rarely spend time in the deep squat position, your nervous system doesn't realize or recognize that that position is anything you care about or that will be challenged.
Yeah.
So it will never adapt to it. So if you want to improve that deep squat position, we need to address the fact that the nervous system needs to get comfortable there. And the way to do that is to spend more time in that position. So the most simple thing you can do if you want to improve your deep squat position is to spend more time down there. So when somebody comes to us and they're very new and that is one of their goals, or it's at least kind of a component of the goal, like maybe they're struggling with knee pain in the deep squat, or they just want to improve their deep squat, then we'll generally get them spending 5-ish minutes accumulated throughout the day to start there. And that'll be like the daily protocol.
Yeah. Okay.
Let's start with 5 minutes per day. That, like, we won't apply progressive overload to start. Let's just start introducing that position more often and see how your body responds. And then over time, as we start to see changes, then we can start implementing more intensity and stimulus throughout that. But yeah, spending more time in the positions.
On the squat specifically, how much do you use like stability or ways that people can like, do you allow people to assist themselves into these positions? Or are you like, hey, we're pretty we're raw with this, like you just go down to the bottom of the squat and you can't hold on to anything and just stay down there as long as you can?
Yeah, so that would generally be more like maybe a few weeks in.
Okay.
Right? So it's, as I was saying earlier, like it's really about finding a logical entry point and meeting the people where they're at. Because if you just throw somebody who really has a restricted deep squat position and you're like, no support whatsoever, you need to get down there, they're going to compensate to find a way to get into the deepest squat position. But if we just get them sitting deeper, letting, if we elevate their heels, so whether they have weightlifting shoes or just sitting on a standing on a platform of some sort, they're going to get more knee flexion. They're going to get more hip flexion and internal rotation. They're probably going to expose a little bit more ankle dorsiflexion, even just because it's more comfortable down there for a longer period of time. So if we use support and meet them where they're at, they're able to challenge their joints more appropriately, and they're actually going to get more out of it than if we're like, no, this is the ideal position that we're trying to improve. You can't support it in any way. It's going to progress slower. That's what we found anyways. It progresses slower if you just kind of try to, if you don't kind of coax it naturally, you know what I mean?
Yeah. I have a final question to you before we get to that. What you just said reminded me of something I wanted to share earlier, and it was sort of like an anecdote, my personal experience around this like idea that like there's a one way to do it this way. This is the best position possible. You talked earlier about like many injuries or many issues that people run into when it comes to resistance training or just training in general, is that they've been told there's an optimal position, and they've optimized for it for so long, and then the moment they deviate from it, that's where they become vulnerable. And this was like my CrossFit experience and my competitive experience in like a nutshell, was that I was so married to a certain position, mostly in squatting and in hinging, because we do so much of it, that I was just like, I adopted this like almost like rod like back position, and also a very, very programmed hip angle when I would get into some of these positions that I never deviated from. And it was almost like I had built in like kind of my own bracing system that would tolerate a lot of stress. But eventually we pushed through that stress in CrossFit, and I would find myself, if I had a slight deviation from good form, I would tweak something and it would be really painful. Like the moment I just rounded my back even like the slightest bit in a deadlift. It was like, oh my gosh, there goes my left-sided low back pain that is recurring. And so I love this idea that like, hey, let's at least look at the margins a bit more. Like, there's not one right position. There are no dangerous positions. Like, it's just positions you haven't spent a lot of time in. That's one thing I would change. People say, hey, what would you change going back to what you did as a CrossFit athlete? Nothing really about how I approached the lifestyle and everything. But, from a training perspective, I would have been like, yeah, I need to do more rounded back deadlifting. I need to do like deep squats, even though I'm only getting credit for going hip crease below knee. Like, why not do some more ass to grass squats just to give me a little bit more buffer, for when the clean pushes me, pushes my butt down between my ankles, like when it gets heavy. So anyway, that was just an aside, and I'm happy to, if you want to like either relate to that or if you have anything to add, this would be, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I feel like that's very relevant for those that are more active and under the barbell, right? Like getting into that deep squat position is very relevant. Although you were saying that it's really you're only being credited for just below parallel pretty much.
Yep.
For those that are just like, if we're trying to carry this over into the everyday life, which a lot of us, we want to train to be better at everyday life. Sure. Right? So, when you're bending down to pick something up off of the ground, if you're not training those ranges of motion, eventually they start to become less lubricated and less they feel like they're less lubricated. They feel like they're more restricted. And then that ends up causing you to avoid them a little bit more. And then over time, that kind of cycle begins. And then that's when your joints stop offering you those deeper ranges of motion. You can't access them the same way because there was some kind of cycle that happened in the past that forced you to stop doing that, whether it was pain, whether it was just kind of like your lifestyle. So if you work at a desk, you're seated in that same position for hours and hours and hours for decades potentially. Yeah. Then some of those positions become far more challenging to access. But again, like spending more time in the positions you wish to improve, being that principle that we subscribe to, is like we just get down there more often, and that's super approachable. I find is like if you're sitting at a desk for 10 hours a day, get up and move every 30 minutes, even if that's like a 2-minute thing. Just stand up, get your hips out of flexion, maybe even like rotate your spine a little bit, like a nice little stretch routine, whatever, just to move your joints and your muscles out of that same position over time. And that in itself will actually have a huge influence in over how you feel over the years. Yeah. So if you can just adopt that now, like set a timer for 30 minutes, whatever, or just remind yourself in some way, even staying super hydrated, you got to get up to pee more often, right? Gets you out of the chair, gets you moving into hip extension, rotating your spine. Yeah. No,
that's beautiful. I mean, that's kind of what I wanted to finish with, was like, what are some action steps people can take? And if we're speaking to the person who's working in a sedentary or desk job,
a lot of us do these days, right?
Yeah. I love the hydration hack. It's like people complain about like, oh, I have to take so many trips to the bathroom. It's like, well, that's actually saving you. Not like your hydration is now impacting your mobility and your muscle tissues and your joints because it's forcing you to move.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely not everything, but it's like a good little, like a movement snack, you know?
So you're telling me I can't just like drink more water and my mobility is fixed?
Hey, I have to, for the crowd.
Somebody who heard that is like, oh, that's all I need to do.
Perfect.
And spend more time in the positions. Okay. We talked about spending more time in the deep squat. Is there something for like the shoulder that you...
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So dead hangs, like hanging off of a pull-up bar, is one of my absolute favorite things to do for many, many different things. So the benefits there are countless pretty much. But if you're struggling with shoulder pain, shoulder discomfort, or really just struggling with the overhead position in general, hanging from a pull-up bar is going to help expose everything necessary to improve that. There's like a decent amount of research from certain areas that will show that hanging can actually have like a structural impact on the shoulder itself. So if there's any structural issues there, it can actually help improve that as well, which is very interesting. But yeah, that's
beautiful. So we've simplified mobility. Hopefully we've defined it for you all. Get yourself hanging from a bar more often, get down in the deep squat more often, and hydrate or stand up every 30 minutes out of your desk.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome.
Keep it simple.
Before we go, Matt, tell the audience how they can either get in touch with you, learn more from you, or if they resonate a lot and they want to become one of your clients, where can they go?
So you could start by checking us out on our website, so www.primalmobility.com. You can check out our end range program there. That is like the most introductory program that we're going to have, and you'll be getting some incredible results there for a good rate, very cheap and introductory, so that'll be helpful. If you have questions and want to interact with me personally, you can just jump over to my Instagram, primal.mobility. So at primal.mobility and toss me a DM there, and I'm very responsive and love interacting and answering any questions and guiding people in the right direction. So
awesome. You guys should definitely go give them a follow. I know most of you listeners are on Instagram. Lots of good information there, and check their website out. And again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, sir.